Calder Vane didn't knock. He walked straight through the gate of Elowen Mercer's orchard like he already owned it because, in his mind, he did. He had the briefcase, the government seal, the practiced smile that never reached his eyes, and a document folded in thirds he slapped against her front porch railing, like he was dealing cards at a table where she wasn't allowed to win. "You have 30 days. Miss Mercer," he said, not even looking at her. He was already scanning the tree rows, calculating, pricing things in his head while she was still standing there with dirt on her hands and her grandfather's pruning shears in her fist. After that, the state begins formal acquisition proceedings. "I'd suggest you find somewhere else to be." He said it the way men like him always say things, not cruel enough to be confronted, not kind enough to be forgiven. Elowen didn't answer. She looked at the document. Then she looked at the man on the other side of the fence, who had gone very still. Gideon Thorne, 58 years old, broad-shouldered jaw set like it was carved from the same limestone that lined his creek bed. He'd heard every word, and for the first time in a long time, Elowen saw something in his eyes that wasn't distance. It was fury. If you've ever been told your home isn't worth fighting for by someone who never had to fight for anything, then you already know exactly how this story feels. Stay with me, because what happened next changed two lives, exposed a conspiracy that went all the way to the mayor's office, and began with the most unexpected words ever spoken across a broken fence line. I'm so glad you found this channel. Stories about real courage, stubborn love, and the kind of people who refuse to quit speak to you. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss one. And when we're done today, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels now. Let's go back to the beginning. The fence between the Thorne Ranch and the Mercer Orchard had been broken in the same 3 places for 11 years. Gideon knew this because he had meant to fix it. 11 years ago, the autumn after Lenora died, when he'd made himself a list of things to do that might keep his hands busy enough that his mind couldn't go where it kept trying to go. He'd written it down in pencil on the back of a feed receipt: fix south fence, clean gutters, call Rowan. He'd done none of them. He'd put the receipt in the kitchen drawer where things go to become permanent reminders of failure, and there it had stayed. The fence stayed broken too. For 11 years, it had just been him, and the cattle and the particular silence of a house that used to hold music. Lenora had always had something playing not from a radio, but from herself. She hummed while she cooked. She sang under her breath doing dishes, not because she had a beautiful voice. She absolutely did not, but because silence made her nervous, and she'd told him once that she was filling it up before the world could fill it with something worse. He used to tease her about it. He hadn't played a single song in 11 years. So when Elowen Mercer showed up at the end of March, driving a truck that was older than most of his fence posts, and carrying boxes of things that clearly hadn't been packed by someone who intended to stay jumbled, overfull, one of them with a broken bottom that was actively failing, as she carried it up the porch steps, Gideon watched from his side of the fence and felt the specific discomfort of a man who knows he should offer help, but isn't sure he remembers how. He didn't know her then. He knew the Mercer name. He knew old Harlan Mercer had let that orchard go to half ruin in his last years, and that he died the previous winter without, as far as Gideon had heard, any family left to speak of. Clearly that intelligence had been incomplete. She dropped the box. Apples, or what had once been apples, dried and shriveled, probably a sample collection from the trees scattered across the porch steps and bounced into the dead grass. She stood there looking at them with her hands on her hips and her jaw tight, and she didn't cry, which Gideon noticed. She just said something under her breath that he was too far away to hear, but could reasonably guess, and then she started collecting the apples one by one and putting them back. He went back inside. He told himself that was the right thing to do. The right thing to do, it turned out, lasted about 4 days. On the 5th day, he found one of his cattle, a 3-year-old Hereford with a genius for finding structural weakness, standing in the middle of Elowen Mercer's orchard, placidly eating something from the ground that absolutely did not belong to her. Gideon got the animal out through the broken fence, and then he stood there in the gap with a coil of wire in one hand and the fence pliers in the other, and he heard footsteps behind him. "Is that yours?" she asked. "Was," he said. "She's back where she belongs." "I'm sorry about your." He looked at whatever the animal had been eating. "I'm not sure what that was. Experimental grafting stock," Elowen said. 3 months of work. He looked at her then, for the first time up close. She was younger than he'd registered from a distant late 20s, maybe, with brown hair that was fighting its own braid and losing, and eyes that were the flat gray-green color of the creek in winter. She wasn't angry the way he'd expected. She was tired. There's a difference, and he recognized it immediately because it was the only expression he'd worn for about 11 years. "I'll replace it," he said, "or pay you for it, however you want to handle it." "You can fix the fence," she said. "That's how I want to handle it." So he fixed the fence, or started to, and she handed him things without being asked, which was either intuition or a determination not to just stand there watching. And somewhere around the second hour of work, he found that he'd said more words out loud than he typically managed in a week. That was the beginning, or the closest thing to one. The beginning, that Watson to beginning, stretched across 2 months that Red Hollow later chose to remember very selectively, depending on who was doing the remembering. What actually happened was this: Gideon found reasons to be useful. Not because he was pursuing anything, he would have refused that description with genuine indignation, but because the Mercer orchard was in a state of neglect that offended some practical part of him that he couldn't switch off. And because Elowen never asked for help in a way that made it feel like charity. She asked the way you ask someone who's standing right next to you and happens to know how to do something you don't. "Can you tell me why the irrigation pressure is wrong on the north side?" Not a question exactly, an invitation to look at a problem. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. She was rebuilding something real, and he could see it. Every week the orchard looked slightly less abandoned. She'd been a horticultural apprentice somewhere down south. Before inheriting this place, she knew more about root systems and soil chemistry than anyone in Red Hollow, and she was not shy about having opinions, which the men at the feed store found baffling, and which Gideon found, privately, somewhat refreshing. She also burned dinner at least twice a week. She'd told him this herself, without embarrassment, when he'd smelled something alarming from across the fence line one evening and looked over to find her standing on her porch fanning smoke out her front door with a dish towel. "Do you want he'd started?" "No," she said. "I'm learning." "What are you learning?" "That I set temperatures wrong." She'd looked at the dish towel. Every single time. That had made him laugh. Actually laugh, out loud, the kind that surprises you, and she'd looked at him with an expression he didn't quite know how to categorize, something between pleased and careful, and then she'd gone back inside to deal with the smoke. That night, he'd stood in his own kitchen for 10 minutes trying to remember what laughing felt like. The fence conversation happened on a Tuesday in May, and it was entirely his fault. They had been working on a section of the south boundary where 3 posts had rotted through at the base proper replacement work, dig it out and start over work, not the patched wire and hope variety he'd done in March. It was hot. He had been working since 6 in the morning, and his back was reminding him, with considerable authority, that he was 58 years old. Elowen was working beside him, doing the tamping with a consistency that suggested she'd done harder physical labor than most people gave her credit for, and she was talking. She often talked while she worked, in the comfortable way of someone who wasn't performing conversation, but just happened to be filling the air about what she was planning for the orchard next season. Heritage varieties, a small press operation if she could get the equipment. A little roadside stand, maybe, not for the money, but because she liked the idea of people stopping. "You're good at this," he said. He meant the work. He also meant everything else, but he didn't say that part. "I'm getting there," she said. "My grandfather didn't teach me enough before he got sick. I'm making up for lost time." Something in that making up for lost time hit a nerve he hadn't known was exposed. He set his post driver down and straightened up, and he said the thing that had been sitting in the back of his head for 2 months, without permission to exist. If I were 20 years younger, he said, I'd marry you. He said it like a joke, because it was a joke. It had to be a joke. It was the only category available for something that true, coming from someone in his position. Standing on his side of a fence that separated a 58-year-old man from a 28-year-old woman who had her whole life arranged in front of her like something that hadn't been touched yet. He expected her to laugh. That was what you did with a joke. You laughed. You moved on. The awkward thing dissolved. She didn't laugh. She set down her own tool and looked at him the way she looked at problems in the orchard, directly, without flinching, with the specific attention of someone who intended to understand something rather than just react to it. I never asked you to be younger, she said. The silence afterward was long enough that a bird somewhere started and stopped in the middle of its own song. Elowen, I'm not finished, she said, not unkindly. I never asked you to be younger, Gideon. I never asked you to be anything other than what you are. And what you are is the only person in this town who shows up when something needs doing, who talks to me like I have a brain, and who has never once looked at me like I'm a problem that needs to be managed. She picked her tool back up. So I don't know what you're trying to do with that joke. But I wish you wouldn't. He didn't have words for that. He stood there with dirt on his hands, and the sun too loud on the back of his neck, and the thing in his chest that he had been very carefully not looking at, for 2 months cracked open just slightly, like a window that hadn't been opened in years sticking, and then giving way all at once. He didn't say anything. She didn't push. They finished the fence section in silence that felt different from the silence before, heavier and cleaner at the same time, and when she went inside that evening, she said goodnight the same way. She always said it brief, unsentimental, like a period at the end of a sentence, and he walked back across to his own property and sat on his own porch in the dark for a long time, arguing with himself about things he wasn't ready to name. Then Calder Vane came to town. He arrived on a Thursday in a government vehicle that was too clean for the roads around Red Hollow, wearing a jacket that was too pressed for anywhere that wasn't a city, carrying documentation with enough official stamps to make anyone's stomach drop. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a way that knew it symmetrical, smooth, the sort of handsome that comes with awareness of itself, and he introduced himself at the post office and the general store and the diner with the careful friendliness of someone building a reputation quickly. Government land agent, regional development assessment, just preliminary surveying, nothing to worry about. The people of Red Hollow had heard nothing to worry about from government men before. They worried. Gideon heard about it the same afternoon, secondhand from the woman who ran the post office, who had the useful quality of remembering everything verbatim. He went home and did not think about Calder Vane, and then thought about him the entire evening, which was functionally the same thing. The next morning, Vane was at Elowen's gate. Gideon saw the vehicle from his pasture and walked over without deciding to. He came through the gap in the fence repaired now, properly, but still the place where things passed between one property and the other, and arrived on Elowton's side just in time to see Calder Vane set a document on her porch railing with the particular confidence of a man who had done this before and found it easy. You have 30 days, Miss Mercer, Vane said. After that, the state begins formal acquisition proceedings. I'd suggest you find somewhere else to be. Elowen looked at the document. Gideon looked at Calder Vane, and Vane, noticing him for the first time, gave him the polite, dismissing smile of someone who has already decided another person is not relevant to the conversation. Mr. Thorne, Vane said, glancing at the paperwork. You're actually on the list as well. I'll be by your property tomorrow. The proposed transportation corridor affects both holdings. He picked up his briefcase. I'd recommend you both consult with someone who understands land law. This process tends to move faster than people expect. He left. The gate didn't quite latch behind him. It never does with men like that. Elowen stood very still on her porch steps, holding the document with both hands. Gideon came and stood beside her, not touching, not speaking, just there, which was, he realized, the only thing he knew how to offer that had any value. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and held it against her chest. "I'm not leaving," she said. Her voice was steady. But her hands weren't. "No," Gideon said, "you're not." She looked at him. "Do you have anything in that attic of yours? Old papers, agreements, anything that shows your family and mine had dealings? The document says there's a clause about historical joint operation. If we could prove the two properties functioned together at some point." "I haven't been up in that attic in years," he said. "I know." She met his eyes. "I think it's time." He wanted to say that it was more complicated than she understood, that the attic held more than just old papers, that Lenora had stored things up there in the last years of her life boxes he'd carried up and closed the hatch on and told himself he'd deal with eventually, which was the same word he used for everything he couldn't face. He wanted to say all of that. Instead, he said, "Tomorrow morning." Early, she nodded once, like they'd shaken hands on something. And above them, somewhere on the far side of the valley, the first clouds of what would become a very long storm were just beginning to build at the edge of the ridge, too far away to see yet, too certain to avoid. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight Gideon went home, stood in his kitchen for a long time, and for the first time in 11 years, he opened the window. The attic hatch had a pull cord that had frayed down to almost nothing, and it took Gideon 3 tries to get it open. He stood on the second-floor landing with his arm above his head and yanked, and the third time the hatch gave way, with a sound like something that had been sealed too long finally deciding to breathe. And a smell came down with it, dust and cedar, and something else he couldn't name but recognized immediately in his chest, the way you recognize a voice before you've consciously placed it. Lenora, not her perfume exactly, she hadn't worn perfume. But the particular combination of the cedar blocks she'd put in every storage space and the lavender sachets she'd sewn herself and something underneath both of those that was just the smell of her life organized into boxes, it hit him on thee. Landing like a hand pressed flat against his sternum, and he stood there for a moment with his jaw tight and his eyes at the ceiling until it passed enough to move through. Elowen was at the bottom of the stairs. She'd stopped at the attic opening, not coming up uninvited, which he appreciated without being able to say so. "Take your time," she said. "No pity in it, just fact." He went up. The attic was lower than he remembered, or he was bigger, probably both. Boxes were stacked in the careful way Lenora had stacked things, labeled in her handwriting on pieces of masking tape, winter linens, Rowan's school things, kitchen overflow, G's ranch records pre-1000, 990. He stood in the middle of it all and made himself look at everything without touching anything for a full 30 seconds, the way you let your eyes adjust to a dark room before you try to move through it. Then he started looking. The ranch records were the obvious place. He pulled the box down and went through it on his knees, feeling the floorboards through his jeans, and Elowen eventually came up quietly, taking the space near the hatch where she could see without crowding him, and she didn't ask how he was doing, which was the right call. She just sat cross-legged on the floor and waited, and when he passed her folders, she looked through them without commentary, and after 2 hours they had found nothing about the Mercer family at all. "It would have been older," Elowen said. "Before your father's time, maybe." "Would there be anything from your grandfather?" "Maybe." He looked at the stacks. "Maybe back here." He worked his way to the far wall where the roof sloped down, and the boxes were older, the tape yellowed, some of the labels faded to the point of illegibility. He was reaching for a box marked miscellaneous correspondence when his hand landed on something that stopped him. It was a smaller box, sitting behind the larger ones, not labeled. Dark blue, the kind that came from a stationery set. And on the lid, in handwriting he knew as well as his own, were the words, "For when you're ready." His name wasn't on it. It didn't need to be. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Elowen, from across the attic, saw his stillness and understood it. "Do you want me to go downstairs?" she asked. "No," he said before he'd decided to say it. "No, stay." He opened the box. Inside was a journal, Lenora's, The dark green one she'd kept on her nightstand, the one he'd thought had been buried with her per her wishes and had apparently not been, the one he now understood, been carrying around in a box in his attic for 11 years, because she had put it there herself before she ran out of time. Underneath the journal was an envelope with his name on it, and underneath that envelope were two folded documents that he didn't touch yet because he was still looking at the journal. He picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. He opened it to the last entry because that's what you do. You go to the last thing first. Her handwriting had gotten harder to read, near the end thinner, less certain, the letters not connecting as cleanly as they used to. But the words were clear enough. He's going to be terrible at this, she had written. He's going to work himself into the ground and call it living, and he's going to say he's fine when Rowan asks, and he's going to mean it, which is the worst part. He genuinely won't know that he's not fine because he's never been good at distinguishing between surviving and living. I've been telling him for 30 years, and it hasn't stuck. I don't know why I think writing it down will help. Gideon stopped. Read it again, but I'm writing it down anyway. Gideon, you are allowed to stop grieving before you die. I want that to be the thing you remember that I said. Not everything else, not the hard parts. This you are allowed to stop. Whenever you're ready, whatever that looks like. He closed the journal. He sat in the attic with the dust and the cedar smell and his late wife's handwriting on the backs of his eyelids, and he did not cry, because he didn't know how to do that anymore, but something shifted in him that he felt in his spine, a slow, structural shift, like a foundation settling, which can look from the outside like nothing at all. He heard Elowen exhale softly across the room. He didn't look at her. He picked up the two folded documents, and the first one, the one on top, was exactly what they'd been looking for. The Mercer Thorne Partnership Inventory, dated 1951, signed by both his grandfather and Elowen's, detailing a shared grazing agreement and joint operation of the apple press that sat, rusting and beautiful, in the far corner of the orchard. It was real. It was original, and, based on the language Calder Vane had used in his acquisition document, it was exactly the kind of historical evidence that would complicate the government's claim. Elowen was across the room in 3 steps. She took the document from his hands and read it again, and then looked up at him with an expression that wasn't triumph, it was something rawer than that. Something closer to the face of a person who has been holding their breath so long they've forgotten what air tastes like. "This is it," she said. "Read the rest of it," Gideon said. Her eyes moved back to the page. He watched her read. He watched the moment she found it the clause that had been there all along, in the last paragraph, in the kind of legal language that was designed to look routine while being anything but. Her face went still in a specific way that he was learning to recognize as Elowen, processing something she didn't want to be true. "The debt clause," she said. Yes, she read it aloud. Not because he needed to hear it, but because saying it out loud was the only way to make something real enough to fight. In the event of financial default by either party, all property held under joint operation reverts to the non-defaulting party as collateral pending resolution. She lowered the page. And there's a notation here. A balance. Unpaid attributed to the Mercer Holdings, dated 1962. She looked at him. "Gideon, if this is valid, your land would be mine," he said. "Legally." Yes, the word legally sat between them, like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were going to take a while to reach the edges. "I don't believe my grandfather defaulted on anything," she said. "I know. I'm not saying I think I'm not," she stopped. She was working to keep her voice from doing something she didn't want it to do. "This changes the situation. It doesn't change anything I plan to do with it," he said. She looked at him sharply. "That document stays in this attic," he said. "Or we burn it. I don't care which. It is not evidence I intend to use." "You can't just Gideon. That's a legal document." "It's a piece of paper in a box in my attic that I've never seen before today and that I have no intention of submitting to anyone." "There is a difference." He stood up, knees complaining about the floor. We take the partnership inventory to counter Vane's claim. That's all. She stared at him for a moment with that flat, evaluating look she got when she was deciding whether someone meant what they said. Okay, she said. Okay, she said again. And then, quieter, thank you. He picked up Lenora's journal and held it for a moment, and then set it carefully back in the blue box, because he wasn't ready for it yet, and he knew himself well enough to know that ready would have to come in its own time. He closed the lid. He left the envelope unopened. He carried the box back to where it had been and set it in the same position, label side facing the wall. They went downstairs. They did not speak about the journal on the way down, or the debt clause again that evening, or the particular weight of all the things that had been said in a low-ceilinged attic between two people who were not, technically, anything to each other yet. But they did not speak about it either. It sat in the air between them, the same way the storm clouds had been sitting on the ridge all week, present, unavoidable, just not yet arrived. The arrival came from a direction neither of them expected. Mabel Fitch worked at the county recorder's office on Tuesdays and ran the Red Hollow Ladies Auxiliary the rest of the time, which gave her an authority over local information that was arguably more powerful than any elected position in the county. She had been at the post office when Calder Vane introduced himself. She had been at the diner when he asked about local land history. And she had a nephew who occasionally did odd jobs for the family that handled estate paperwork for old Harlan Mercer's affairs. Gideon did not know this. He should have. On a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the attic, he was in Red Hollow at the hardware store buying weatherproofing supplies when he walked past a table of women having coffee and heard his own name. He didn't stop walking, but he slowed enough, carrying things up to her porch, fixing her equipment, and now they're going through his attic together. How old is she, 20-something? 28. And he's what, pushing 60, 58. A pause. Then the voice Gideon recognized as Mabel's. You know what I heard? I heard there's a document. An old agreement that gives him some kind of claim on her property. And she knows about it. Makes you wonder what she's really after out there. He kept walking. His hands were fine. His face was fine. He paid for his supplies and loaded them into his truck and drove back toward the ranch with both hands on the wheel, and something cold and steady settling in his stomach that he recognized as the particular anger of a man who has. Watched something clean get touched by dirty hands. He didn't tell Elowen what he'd heard, not immediately. He needed to think about it first, which was a habit of his that Lenora had called his worst quality you think about things, until they calcify Gideon, and then I can't get at them anymore. And he knew it was a problem, and he did it anyway, because some habits are older than self-awareness. He thought about it for 2 days. In those 2 days, Calder Vane came back. Vane came not to Elowen's gate this time, but to Gideon's, which was different and deliberate, and he was carrying coffee in 2 paper cups from the diner in town, which was either an attempt at charm or a calculated move to appear harmless, and Gideon wasn't sure which was worse. He accepted the coffee because refusing it would have been a conversation, and he didn't want the conversation yet. I wanted to speak with you separately, Vane said, standing at the fence line, the original fence line, Gideon's side, where the cattle grazed in unhurried indifference behind him. The acquisition order affects you differently than it affects Miss Mercer. Your ranch has been established longer. You have more room to negotiate positioning. If you were willing to work with us on the corridor survey, there's a version of this where your core holdings remain intact. And hers don't, Gideon said. Vane's expression did something careful. The Mercer property is smaller, more recently occupied. Legally more vulnerable. I'm trying to give you an honest picture. I appreciate that, Gideon said. He drank the coffee. It was too sweet. What does working with you on the survey look like? Cooperation with our assessment team, not contesting the initial findings. Acknowledging that your operation hasn't historically depended on the neighboring orchard. Gideon set the cup down on the fence post. No, mister. Thorne, the 2 properties have operated jointly, Gideon said. I have documentation that proves it. Any assessment you conduct that ignores that history is an incomplete assessment, which means any findings based on it are, he paused, turning the right word over incomplete. Vane looked at him for a moment, then something in his face shifted, just slightly, the way the angle of a door shifts when someone changes their grip on it from the other side. There's also, Vane said carefully, the matter of a debt clause in that same documentation. If the joint operation inventory is as you describe, it's possible the full document introduces complications you may not want introduced. Gideon went very still. Who told you about the debt clause, he said. Not a question. Vane heard that. I'm a government land agent, Vane said. I do my research. Who? Gideon said again. Vane picked up his own coffee cup and looked at the cattle. I just suggest you think carefully about what documentation you file and what it might expose. He left, same as the first time. The gate didn't quite latch. Gideon stood at his fence and understood two things simultaneously. First, that someone had gotten to Vane already, someone who had access to information about what was in that attic, which meant someone who either had connections to the Mercer estate records or had been watching more closely than Gideon had realized. Second, that the debt clause was now in play, whether Gideon filed the document or not, which meant withholding. It was no longer the simple protection he'd imagined. He went to Elowen. He told her everything: the hardware store, Mabel's table, Vane's visit, the debt clause surfacing on its own. He told her, standing in her kitchen, while she stood at the counter, with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and he did not soften any of it, because she had never once indicated she wanted things softened. She was quiet for a long time. So someone already knows what's in the document, she said. Someone with access to your grandfather's estate records. Or mine, Mabel Fitch's nephew, she said, almost to herself. She looked out the kitchen window. He helped the estate executor go through my grandfather's papers after he died. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Harlan didn't have much. She was quiet again. Then, they're using it to keep us from filing the partnership inventory. If we file the inventory, they introduce the debt clause. The inventory proves the historical joint operation and fights the acquisition. The debt clause complicates your ownership. Either way, someone wins who isn't us. Unless, Elowen said slowly, the debt clause isn't real. He hadn't gotten there yet. He looked at her. My grandfather kept records, she said. He kept everything. I have boxes of his receipts going back to 1955. If there was an unpaid debt of the size described in that clause, there would be a corresponding record in his books, either the debt itself, or the repayment, or correspondence about it. She turned from the window and met his eyes. And there isn't. I went through everything when I first arrived. I was looking for anything that would help establish the property's history. There is no unpaid debt in his records, which means, Gideon said. Which means the clause was added to the document after the fact, she said. The original agreement probably didn't have it at all. Someone altered it, sometime between 1951 and now someone changed that document. The word forged didn't come up yet, but it was in the room. Gideon thought about the two documents in the blue box. The partnership inventory, which they'd handled. The second document, which he hadn't paid much attention to, which he'd assumed was a duplicate or a related record. I need to go back to the attic, he said. This time Elowen came with him without waiting to be asked. The second document was a bill of sale not for land, but for the Apple press equipment. Dated 1963, signed by Elowen's grandfather and notarized by a county official whose name Gideon didn't recognize. On its own, it looked routine, but in the margin, in very small writing that was clearly not part of the original typeset document, were 6 words that changed everything: debt settled in full H. 1963, Elowen said. Harlan Mercer, my grandfather. She looked up. He noted the settlement himself on a separate document. Which means the debt clause in the partnership inventory wasn't just unpaid, it was already settled by 1963. And the clause in the document is dated 1962, Gideon said. She looked at him. The clause says 1,962, he said. The debt was settled in 1,963 according to your grandfather's own notation. If both documents are authentic, the debt existed and was paid. If the debt clause in the partnership inventory is what someone added, later he stopped. Then whoever added it made a mistake, she finished. They didn't know about this. She held up the bill of sale with its marginal notation. They added a false debt, but didn't know there was a corresponding settlement record. They stood in the attic with the two documents and the smell of cedar and the particular silence of something that has been wrong for a long time and is only now being seen for what it is. We need to show these to someone, Elowen said. Someone who knows documents. Who can tell us if the inventory was altered? Gideon thought about who he trusted in Red Hollow, and then he thought about who he trusted who had any expertise in this, and those two lists had very little overlap. Vain, Elowen said. Gideon stared at her. You want to show this to the government land agent. I want to show it to the one person in this situation who has a professional reason to care if a legal document is fraudulent, she said. If the inventory was forged, if someone created a false debt to manipulate ownership records, that's not just a problem for us. That's a problem for him, for his assessment, for whatever case the government is building on the back of these records. She held his gaze. If Caldervane is honest, he helps us. If he's not, we'll know that too. It wasn't a comfortable logic. Gideon didn't trust Vane. But he trusted Elowen's mind, which was increasingly the sharpest instrument he had access to, and she was right that they couldn't sit on this and do nothing. And they didn't have another option that didn't involve lawyers they couldn't afford and timelines they didn't have. All right, he said. All right, let's show Vane the documents. She nodded. Then she said quietly, Did you read the letter? He knew which letter she meant. He'd known she would ask eventually. Not yet, he said. She didn't press. She picked up the bill of sale and the partnership inventory and held them carefully, the way you hold something that might be the most important thing you've ever touched, and she started for the attic hatch. Gideon, she said, not turning around. She sounds like she was a good person. Your wife. He stood in the attic with the blue box behind him, and Lenora's handwriting on a letter he hadn't opened yet, and he said, She was the best person I ever knew. I know, Elowen said. That's what I can tell just from the things you don't say. She went down the hatch. He stood there for another moment. Then he followed. They met Vane at the diner that afternoon, neutral ground, Elowen's idea, because witnesses matter when you don't know if someone is about to be your ally or your next problem. Vane arrived 5 minutes early, which told Gideon he'd been expecting the contact. Elowen laid the documents on the table without preamble. Vane looked at the partnership inventory. Then he looked at the bill of sale. He didn't touch them, yet he looked at them the way someone looks at something they're being careful about, and Gideon watched his face for the tell that would indicate he'd seen this before, that he was part of whatever this was. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something he hadn't expected. Vane's expression shifted from careful to genuinely arrested. The practiced smoothness went somewhere, and underneath it was an expression that was simply a man looking at something that didn't add up and not being able to make it add up. The debt clause, Vane said. He was still looking at the document. We believe it was added after the original agreement was signed, Elowen said. The notation on the second document suggests the debt, if it ever existed, was settled in 1963. The clause is dated 1962 and references an unpaid balance. But there is no record of the balance in my grandfather's books, and there is a record of a corresponding settlement. Vane picked up the inventory. He brought it close to his face, which was not what a man does when he's performing examination. That's what a man does when he actually can't believe what he's looking at. The margin spacing is different, he said, almost to himself. Here and here, he set it down. He looked at them both. This document has been altered. The debt clause was inserted. He said it flatly, without drama, the way you say a fact once you've confirmed it. Which means someone has been manipulating land ownership records in this county. And I need to know who, he looked at Gideon, then at Elowen. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Red Hollow, Calder Vane did not look like a man with the upper hand. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of something much larger than a routine acquisition assessment. The storm which had been building on the ridge all week rolled into the valley that night. The storm came in the way bad things often do gradually, and then all at once. It had been raining since midnight, the ordinary kind of rain that the valley needed and the creek could handle, and Gideon had gone to sleep listening to it on the roof the way he'd done 1,000 times before. By 3 a.m, the sound had changed. Not louder exactly, but different, in quality heavier, more serious. The kind of rain that has somewhere to be and doesn't care what's in its way. He was up and dressed by 3:15. He stood at his kitchen window with coffee he'd made too strong and looked across toward the orchard, and what he saw in the dark was the movement of water where there shouldn't be water, the low field between the two properties filling from below. The creek already beyond its banks somewhere upstream and looking for new geography. He could see one light on in Elowen's house. She was already awake. He called her. She picked up on the first ring. "The north drainage is blocked," she said without hello. "One of the old trees came down last night, and it's sitting across the channel. The water's backing up into the lower orchard. How bad?" "Bad enough." A pause. He could hear wind through her window. "The roof over the storage addition is making sounds I don't like." "I'm coming over, Gideon. You don't need to. I'm already putting my boots on," he said. Which was true. He had the phone wedged between his ear and shoulder and was pulling the left one on. "Don't go up on that roof." "I wasn't going to go up on the roof." "Elowen, I was going to assess from the ladder," she said. "That's different." "It's really not. Stay inside." "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She didn't agree, which was not the same as disagreeing, which meant she was going to do whatever she thought was necessary, and he needed to hurry. He hung up, got the second boot on, pulled his work coat off the hook by the door, the old one, the one with the torn pocket he'd never gotten around to fixing, and went out into the rain. The water in the low field was calf-deep in places, and moving with more intention than he was comfortable with, and he crossed it with his flashlight pointed down and his jaw set, testing each step before committing to it the way his father had taught him, the way you do when the ground you know has temporarily become something else. On the other side, the orchard was full of sound branches straining, something periodically cracking in the high wind, and underneath all of it the low, constant roar of water finding its way. He found Elowen at the base of her ladder. She had not gone up the ladder. She was standing at the base of it, looking up at the roofline of the storage addition, with a flashlight in each hand, which was not the picture of someone who had been safely inside, like he'd told her to be, but was at least better than the picture he'd been imagining on the walkover. "The ridge is shifting," she said, not turning around. She'd heard him coming. "You can see it from here. The center is lower than it was 2 days ago." He looked. She was right. The roofline of the old storage addition had developed a sag that hadn't been there before, a slow downward curve that said the structure underneath was taking on more weight than it was built to carry. "The addition was your grandfather's?" he asked. 1970s. "He built it himself." She clicked off one of the flashlights. "Which means he probably built it the way he built everything, which was functional and genuine, but not exactly engineered." "What's in there?" "The press equipment, some of the heritage stock I grafted." 3 months of work. She said it the same way she'd said it the first time, in March, when his cow had eaten the experimental grafting stock flat and practical, the voice of someone who has already done the math on loss and is now focused on what comes after it. "And the documents." He turned to look at her. "The documents are in the storage addition?" "I moved them there 2 days ago because I thought the house was safer. I needed the floor space in the kitchen." She looked at him. "I know, Elowen, I know," she said again. "I'm going up." "You're not going up. I'm going up. You're back." "Is my problem?" he said. He took the ladder from her, and she let him, which told him she'd been thinking about this argument and had already conceded it. He checked the ladder's base. planted it more firmly in the wet ground, and went up. The roof was worse from the top than it had looked from the bottom. The addition's structure was old-growth timber, which was the good news, but two of the main rafters had cracked. He could see the splits from outside when he craned over the ridge, and water was pooling in the center depression and adding weight to a structure that no longer had the strength to carry it. He needed to get the water off and get something bracing under those rafters from inside, and he needed to do both in a rainstorm in the dark, which was exactly the kind of problem that made him understand why people half his age thought they were invincible. He was not half his age. He felt every one of his 58 years on the way back down the ladder. The ridge rafters are cracked, he told her. We need to get those documents out of there and then see if we can run some emergency bracing. If the water keeps pooling, that roof comes down within the hour. She was already moving toward the addition door. He followed. Inside, the sound was different. The rain on the damaged roof was louder, and there was a new sound underneath it, a periodic low creak that was the building communicating its distress in the only language available to it. The documents were in a waterproof case on the workbench. Elowen had at least done that right, and she grabbed it while he looked at the rafters from below. There's a brace kit in the lean-to, she said. My grandfather's. Of course there is, he said, because Harlan Mercer had kept everything, including 70-year-old women with journals and document boxes hidden in attics, and apparently also emergency structural supplies. Gideon would have found this charming if the roof wasn't actively trying to come down on them. He got the bracing. He got it in place not perfectly. There was nothing perfect about it. It was emergency bracing in a rainstorm installed by a man with a bad back and a flashlight he'd set on the workbench and kept knocking sideways with his elbow, but he got 2 cross braces under the worst sections of the rafters, and Elowen held the 3rd while he fastened it, standing on the workbench to reach the right angle, and by the time he came down the creek had reduced to something he thought might hold through the night if the rain let up by morning. The rain did not let up by morning. By 5 a.m., the flooding in the low field had cut off the path back to Gideon's property. Not impossibly he could have waded through it, but imprudently. The water was moving fast enough to require real caution, and both of them recognized without discussing it that there was no good reason for him to cross it in the dark when they had the situation here somewhat under control, and it would be safer in daylight. He stayed. Elowen made coffee. He sat at her kitchen table with his wet jacket on the back of the chair and his hands wrapped around the mug. And outside the rain kept coming, and neither of them said anything for a while because neither of them needed to. Then she said, You're soaking wet and you just braced a collapsing roof in the dark. How's your back? Fine, he said. She looked at him. It's been better, he said. She got up and came back with a worn heating pad that she plugged in and set on the table next to him without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. She had gone back to her coffee and was not making anything of it, which meant he didn't have to either. He plugged it in. The gossip in town, he said. He'd been carrying this since the hardware store. About you. About what people are saying you're doing out here. She set her mug down, Mabel Fitch and whoever else. That you're pursuing this. He stopped. The language was wrong. Every configuration of language for this was wrong. That your interest in this situation and in me is about the land. That you're protecting yourself. Elowen was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who has been surprised. The quiet of someone who already knew this was coming and had been deciding how to respond to it. I know what they're saying, she said. And I don't plan to spend my life explaining myself to Mabel Fitch. She picked her mug up again. Do you believe it? The question was direct in the way all her questions were direct, no hedging, no softening of the stakes. If he said yes, she would know. If he said no and didn't mean it, she would probably also know. No, he said, I don't believe it. Then it doesn't matter, she said. It matters because people are saying it. It matters because it's being used to discredit the evidence we're trying to build. It matters because he stopped again. Because it bothers you, she said. Yes, because you care what they think of me. He didn't answer. Which was also an answer. She set her mug down very carefully, the way she did when she was choosing her words. Outside, something cracked in the orchard, a branch giving way, or another tree coming down, and they both looked toward the window automatically, then back. "Gideon," she said, "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, which means I need you to not start thinking about all the reasons it's complicated before I'm done." He made himself stay still. "I'm out here because I inherited a piece of land that my grandfather loved and I love, and that I plan to spend the next 40 years of my life rebuilding into something real. That's why I'm here. It has nothing to do with your property or your documents or anything the town thinks." She held his gaze. "What's happening between us, whatever it is not the same thing as the land. I know you're having trouble keeping those two things separate, but they are separate, and I think you know that. It's not that simple. Most things aren't," she said. "That doesn't mean you get to use complicated as a reason to not feel what you're feeling." The rain hit the window in a gust that rattled the glass. He said, "I'm 30 years older than you. I know how old you are. In 20 years, I'll be 48 and you'll be 78, and that's a long way from now, and I'm not living in a calculation." She said it without heat, which somehow made it harder to argue with. "You're using age the same way you use that back of yours, as a reason to stop before something can hurt you." That landed somewhere specific. He looked at the table. "Lenora died," he said, and then he stopped, because he hadn't planned to say that, hadn't planned to say any of this. But something in him had cracked open in that attic 2 days ago, the same way those rafters had cracked tonight, and now things were coming through the opening without permission. She was sick for 2 years, and she died, and I watched every minute of it, and I told myself I would never that I was done with loving somebody that much, because he stopped again. He made himself keep going, because I am not equipped to go through that again. I'm not built for it. Some people are. I'm not." Elowen was very still. "And I'm aware," he said, "that there is something here. Between us. I'm not unaware of it. You have 30 years ahead of you that should have someone in them who can keep up. Who doesn't come with all this?" He gestured at himself in a way that meant the back and the grief and the 11 years of calcified silence, all of it weight. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You think protecting me from yourself is kindness. I think it might be the most honest thing I can offer you." "No," she said. "The most honest thing you can offer me is the truth about what you want. Protecting me from you is just fear with a better name." The heating pad clicked on with a low hum. The rain came harder. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat with it, and she let him sit with it, and outside the storm was doing everything storms do, taking what wasn't secured, rearranging what was, leaving the landscape different in the morning than it had been the night before. The collapse happened at 6:47. Not the whole structure, just the back corner of the storage addition, where the original foundation had never been great and the water had found the weakness. There was a sound like a held breath releasing all at once, and then a crash that shook the floor under them, and then silence, and then both of them were on their feet and moving for the addition door. The corner had come in. Part of the interior wall had buckled, and in the buckle, where the plaster had broken away from the old lathe beneath it, something had been exposed in the wall cavity that had no business being in a wall cavity. An iron box, old, dark with age, the kind of dark that comes from being inside a wall for a very long time. It had a clasp that was rusted closed, and a flat top that was undented, which meant it had been placed in that wall carefully, not hidden in haste. Someone had put it there on purpose. They looked at it. "Your grandfather's?" Gideon said. "Maybe," Elowen said. She was already crouching down, maybe older. He got a pry bar from the tool wall. It was a working space. There were tools everywhere, and worked the clasp until it gave, which took longer than it should have, and required language he would not have used if Elowen hadn't been using the same language herself from behind him. The clasp broke. He opened the lid. Inside, 2 documents in oilskin, folded and sealed with wax that had hardened to powder. And underneath them, a handwritten letter addressed to no one, or rather, to whoever finds this, which means we are all past the point of pretending. Elowyn took the oilskin documents and opened them carefully, laying them flat on the workbench beside a lantern she'd lit when the power flickered. Gideon held the letter. The first document was an authentic version of the Mercer-Thorne Partnership inventory, the real one, the 1951 original, which was immediately and obviously different from the version in the attic. The language was cleaner. The debt clause was not in it. It had never been in it. Someone replaced it, Elowyn said. She wasn't even surprised anymore. She said it the same way she'd say that a tree had root rot, the diagnosis of something that had already happened and couldn't be undone, only managed. They took the original, put a doctored version in the attic, and this, she touched the oilskin, was hidden by someone who knew what was happening. Read the other document, Gideon said. The second document was a family will, older than the partnership inventory by at least a decade. It named both families, Mercer and Thorne, as co-inheritors of what it called the consolidated homestead property, and it included a clause that neither family's portion could be sold or transferred without the consent of both, and further, that in the event the properties were separated, they could only be legally reunified if both were held by a single-family estate. A single-family estate. Gideon read that part twice. Elowyn was already reading it. She looked up at him across the workbench in the lantern light, with the rain on the broken roof and the wall open beside them, and the box sitting on the floor where it had been for 60 years or more, and she didn't say anything. She just looked at him. He read the letter. It had been written by a woman named Clara Dean, whose name Gideon didn't recognize until the third paragraph, where she identified herself as the county recorder's secretary in 1961. And then everything snapped into focus like a picture you've been holding too close, finally pulled to the right distance. She had witnessed the original agreement being removed from the county files and replaced with an altered version. She had known who ordered it and why. She had been afraid and had said nothing for 2 years, and then she had taken the original documents. How? She didn't specify. Only that she'd found a way and hidden them because she couldn't bring herself to destroy evidence of what she called a deliberate theft of two families' futures and couldn't safely come forward with it. She had hidden it in the wall. She had written, "If this is ever found, let it be by someone who still has time to use it. I had time and did not use it. That is my shame to carry." Gideon folded the letter. He set it on the workbench next to the two documents. The lantern between them threw light up at their faces from below, which was the wrong kind of light for either of them to look good in. But they weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about a woman named Clara Dean, who had hidden the truth in a wall 60 years ago, and about the fact that someone in Red Hollow had known or suspected that it was there. The will, Elowyn said. She was looking at the single-family clause. Gideon, if both properties can only be reunified under a single-family estate. I know, he said. The acquisition order becomes invalid. The whole government claim falls apart if we can prove these documents are authentic and that the separation was fraudulent. She was working through it out loud, which was how her mind moved when it was running fast. But to invoke the consolidation clause to make this legally binding, we'd have to operate as a single family, he said. She looked at him. He looked at the will. Which means, he said carefully, either we find a way around that requirement in executor, some legal structure, or, she said. She didn't finish it. Neither of them finished it. The word marriage sat in the space between them the way the documents had sat in the wall there all along, waiting for someone to open the right thing. Outside, the storm was easing. Not over, not by any measure, but the hardest part had passed, the way the hardest parts always eventually do, and in the gray pre-dawn the rain had dropped from a roar to a persistent, manageable sound. Through the broken wall, they could see the sky beginning to change color at the edges. Then Gideon's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost let it go, but something made him answer, some instinct that this particular night had too many things in it for even an unknown call to be random. It was Calder Vane. "I need you to listen," Vane said. He sounded like someone who had not slept, or like someone who had slept and woken to something that made sleep irrelevant. I've been going through county land records since yesterday. Not just your properties, the surrounding valley. 6 other farms along the proposed route. Gideon said, "What did you find?" "Survey manipulations," Vane said. "Assessments that don't match the actual measurements. Devaluations that were applied selectively. And signatures on county authorization documents that I now have serious doubts are genuine." A pause. "Someone has been doing this for a long time. This isn't about one acquisition. This is about the whole corridor, every farm along it." Gideon looked at Elowen. She could hear Vane's voice from a foot away, and he watched her face as she processed it. "Vane," Gideon said, "who signs the county authorization documents?" A pause that was a beat too long. "The mayor's office," Vane said. "Mayor Rourke." The name dropped into the room. Elowen's expression didn't change. It just went still in that particular way, the way of someone who is not surprised but is rearranging everything anyway, slotting new information into a picture that has suddenly become much larger than it looked before. "We found documents last night," Gideon said. "Original documents. In a hidden compartment in the storage edition." He looked at Elowen as he said the next part. "I think you need to see them." Another pause. "I'll come to you," Vane said. "Don't move those documents. Don't tell anyone else about them until I get there." He hung up. Gideon set the phone on the workbench next to Clara Dean's letter and the 2 oilskin documents and the lantern that was still throwing light up at the wrong angles. Elowen was looking at the single-family clause in the will. "He's coming here," Gideon said. "I heard." She didn't look up from the document. He watched her read it. He watched the particular set of her jaw and the way she held her breath without seeming to. And he thought about what she had said 3 hours ago. That fear, with a better name, was still fear. And he thought about Lenora's handwriting on a page he hadn't opened yet, and the particular instruction it carried. And he thought about 30 years of age difference, and 20 years ahead of him, if he was lucky. And all the calculations he'd been running since March, like they would eventually add up to something that wasn't just another form of hiding. They didn't add up to that. They never had, he said, Elowen. She looked up. "I heard what you said before. About fear. He wasn't good at this." He'd never been good at this, even at 30, and the intervening decades had not improved his facility with saying the thing he meant without engineering around it. "I'm not going to pretend I've got it sorted. I don't. But I want you to know that the reason I came across that flooded field at 3 in the morning wasn't because of the roof." She waited. "It was because you had one light on," he said. "And I didn't want you to be in whatever this was alone." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "That's the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know, it's also the most honest. I know that too." Outside, the rain had dropped to almost nothing. The sky was getting lighter. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird that had no business being cheerful started anyway. She picked up the will with its single-family clause and held it between them, and she didn't say anything else about it, and neither did he. But the document was there, and they both knew what it said. And for the first time since Calder Vane had slapped an acquisition notice on her porch railing, both of them were thinking about the same thing, not the problem, not the land, not the conspiracy that went all the way to the mayor's office. Just the clause, just the specific, impossible, unavoidable shape of the one solution neither of them had planned for, and both of them had been circling since a Tuesday in May, when a man said something as a joke and a woman didn't laugh. Vane arrived at 7:15, 45 minutes after the call. He came through the orchard on foot because the Lowfield Road was still flooded, and he arrived at the broken wall of the storage addition still in yesterday's clothes, which told Gideon he had been working through the night and hadn't gone home. He looked at the iron box. He looked at Clara Dean's letter. He read the will. He sat down on the workbench and put his face in his hands for a moment that wasn't long, but was genuine. "Rourke has been running this for at least 12 years, he said. "I can see it in the assessment records. The corridor isn't about transportation. It's about the land on either side of it. He's been driving down property values along the route, waiting for families to sell or get forced out, and buying through intermediaries. How many properties? Elowen asked. 6 that I can confirm. Maybe more. Vane looked up. This will, combined with the original inventory, if I can verify their authenticity through the State Forensic Document Examiner, it not only invalidates your acquisition orders, it's the beginning of a chain of evidence that goes directly to the mayor's office. He looked at the single-family clause. There's one complication we know, Gideon said. Vane looked between them, and then Vane, who was educated and younger, and had the kind of easy handsomeness that Gideon had been quietly uncomfortable about since the man arrived in Red Hollow, did something Gideon hadn't expected. He said carefully, I want to make something clear. I understand the clause, and I want to offer there's a legal mechanism, a temporary estate consolidation that might. Calder, Gideon said. Vane stopped. Gideon looked at Elowen. She was looking back at him. And between them was everything that had been building since March, the fence repairs and the burned dinners, and the 2 months of not saying it, and one Tuesday conversation, and an attic and a 3 a.m. phone call, and 4 hours in a broken building waiting for a roof to stop falling. We'll figure out the clause, Gideon said. He said it to Vane. But he was looking at her. Elowen held his gaze, and something in her face went from braced to quiet, the particular quiet of someone who has been waiting for a very specific thing and has just heard it, and is allowing themselves for the first time to believe it might be real. The morning light came through the broken wall. It was not beautiful, because light through a collapsed wall is never beautiful. It's just light where there was wall before. But it was there, which was more than there had been an hour ago, and in the orchard the bird that had no business being cheerful was still going, and the storm was over, and the iron box was open. And 60 years of buried truth was sitting on a workbench waiting to do what Clara Dean had always intended it to do. They had the documents. They had the evidence. They had inspectors arriving the next morning. And Calder Vane was looking at the floor and giving them the 30 seconds they needed, which was the most useful thing he'd done since he arrived in Red Hollow. And Gideon used every one of those seconds to look at a 28-year-old woman who had never asked him to be younger, and to understand, finally and completely, that fear had been doing his thinking for him for 11 years. That was enough time. More than enough. The inspectors arrived at 8 in the morning in 2 vehicles, which was one more vehicle than Calder Vane had led them to expect, and the extra vehicle had county markings on the door that made Gideon's stomach drop before anyone had stepped out of it. Elowen saw his face. What county? He said quietly. Not state, she understood immediately. If the county office was compromised, if Rourke's people had reached inside the inspection process itself, then showing up with authentic documents and a government land agent on their side might not be enough. The right documents given to the wrong people had a way of disappearing. Vane had spent the night in the broken storage addition, working through the survey records by lantern light, and he looked like it. He met the inspection team at the property line with his credentials out before they'd finished parking. And he had the particular posture of a man who has spent a sleepless night getting his argument perfect and is now running on conviction and coffee. He spoke to the lead state inspector for 4 minutes, while the county man stood to the side and said nothing. Gideon watched the county man's face during those 4 minutes and didn't like what he saw. The state inspector came to the porch where Gideon and Elowen were standing. Mr. Thorne, Miss Mercer, I'm Inspector Adeline Foss, Regional Assessment Division. She was 50s, compact, with the kind of face that was permanently in evaluation mode. Agent Vane has briefed me on the situation. I'd like to see the documents you recovered. What about him? Gideon said. He meant the county man who had drifted toward the storage addition and was looking at the broken wall with too much interest for someone who should have been seeing it for the first time. Foss followed his gaze. Dale Pruitt is here as a county co-observer. Standard protocol. Is it standard protocol to call ahead to the people being investigated? Gideon said. Foss looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. I'm sorry? If Pruitt had any contact with Mayor Rourke's office between Vane's call last night and your arrival this morning, Gideon said, then we have a problem. because the documents we recovered are in this house, and the only reason I'm still comfortable showing them to you is because you arrived before anyone had time to do anything about it. Foss looked at Vane, who had come up behind her. He's not wrong, Vane said. I'd recommend separating Pruitt from the process until we can establish the chain. What followed was 20 minutes of procedural friction that Gideon and Elowen watched from the porch while Foss made phone calls, and Vane spoke with Pruitt, and Pruitt said things that were controlled and professional and completely unreadable. In the end, Pruitt was asked to remain outside the property during the document review, which he accepted with the careful grace of a man who knows he's being watched and has decided compliance is the better strategy for now. Gideon brought the documents to Inspector Foss at the kitchen table. She put on cotton gloves before she touched them, which was the first thing she'd done that made him genuinely trust her. She examined the original partnership inventory and the family will for 11 minutes without speaking, using a magnifying loupe she pulled from her jacket pocket. And the only sounds in the kitchen were the house settling after the storm and Elowen's foot tapping once on the floor and stopping. The oilskin preservation is consistent with the document dates, Foss said finally. The paper stock, the ink oxidation, these will need lab confirmation, but visually, these are authentic originals. She set the loupe down. The version you found in your attic, Mr. Thorne, where is that now? In the attic, Gideon said. I haven't moved it. Don't. She looked at both of them. The comparison between the authentic inventory and the altered version is going to be central to the case against whoever did this. We need both. She looked at Clara Dean's letter, which she'd read twice. This woman. Do you know anything about her? Nothing beyond what she wrote, Elowen said. We'll find her records. Foss folded the letter back with the same careful hands. Agent Vane's survey analysis combined with these documents were looking at a pattern of land fraud that goes back at least 15 years. This isn't a local matter anymore. She looked at Gideon. Your acquisition order is suspended as of this morning. Both properties. Elowen let out a breath. Just one controlled, but Gideon heard it. The single-family consolidation clause, Gideon said. Foss looked at the will. That's a separate matter. The clause is authentic, assuming the document clears forensic review. What it means for the property's legal status going forward is something that will need to be worked through, but it doesn't affect the immediate suspension of the acquisition. She looked between them with a directness that was not unkind. Whatever you two decide about the rest of it is your business, not ours. She stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. The county man outside, she said. I want to be honest with you. I don't know if he made contact. I don't know what Rourke's people know about this morning. What I do know is that by this afternoon, this case will be above the county level, and Rourke's office won't have reach into it. Get through today carefully. She left. Gideon and Elowen stood in the kitchen and listened to the vehicles pull away. Then Elowen sat down at the table where the documents had been and put her hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a moment, her own hands, which were the hands of someone who'd been doing physical work for months, and looked at and she said, We're not done yet, are we? No, Gideon said. Not yet. He was right. They were not done yet. And the evidence of this arrived that same afternoon in the form of 2 police cruisers coming up the drive not to Elowen's property but to Gideon's, which he saw from across the fence line while he was checking the cattle and which sent him crossing back through the gap at a pace that was undignified for a man with his back situation. The officers weren't there for him. They were there for Calder Vane. Vane was standing at the fence near the gate with his hands loose at his sides and the expression of a man who has seen this coming and has already decided how to handle it. 2 officers and a plainclothes county investigator, and the investigator was holding a document that Gideon didn't need to read closely to understand the county seal was visible from 10 feet away. Forgery of government survey documents, the investigator said. He said it with the specific satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict he's been building toward. We have evidence that documents filed with the Regional Assessment Office under your name have been altered. Vane said very calmly, that evidence is fabricated. That's for the review board to determine. I'd like to contact Inspector Foss from the state office, Vane said. You can make that contact from the county office. Elwyn had come through the gap in the fence behind Gideon and stood at his shoulder. Neither of them said anything. This was the moment Foss had warned them about get through today carefully, and what was happening here was Rourke moving before the state investigation could get above county level, flipping the narrative, putting the man who'd found the evidence in a position where the evidence became suspect. Before the officers put Vane in the cruiser, he turned and looked directly at Gideon. Someone already knew about the hidden will, he said. It came out fast, quiet, intended only for Gideon and Elwyn. Before last night, before we found it, I have the survey records that prove the devaluation pattern copies. Not originals, they can't touch them. They're in the regional office already. Foss has them. He held Gideon's gaze for 2 more seconds. Don't let them take the documents. Then he got in the cruiser, and it pulled away. And Gideon and Elwyn stood at his fence in the afternoon light, with the cattle grazing with complete indifference behind them, and the particular silence of people who have just watched something go wrong and are calculating how wrong it can still get. He said someone already knew about the will, Elwyn said. Yes, before we found it. Yes, she thought about that. The wall cavity, the storage addition corner. That corner was structurally compromised before the storm. I noticed it 3 weeks ago. I told someone about it. She was working backward, going through the list in her head, and he watched her face as she found the thread. Mabel Fitch's nephew. He was helping me clear some of the old equipment. I told him the corner looked soft, that I thought there might be foundation damage. And Mabel's nephew talked to Mabel, Gideon said. And Mabel talked to, she stopped. Rourke's office, Gideon said. Or someone connected to it. She stood very still. They knew something might be in that wall. They were waiting for the structural failure. Or planning to cause one. The cattle shifted. One of them made a sound that was deeply unbothered by all of this. Gideon thought briefly about what it would be like to have no inner life, and then put the thought away. We need to call Foss directly, he said. Vane said she has the survey copies. Then she has enough to start, but she needs to know what just happened here. They went inside and Gideon found Foss's card and called. She answered on the second ring and he told her everything: the arrest, Vane's warning, Mabel's nephew, storage corner. Foss listened without interrupting, which was a quality he appreciated in a person. When he was done, she said, "Keep the documents somewhere other than the house tonight. Not a bank, they'll be closed. Somewhere you trust." He thought about that. "How's your relationship with your neighbors?" she asked. "The only neighbor I have is standing in my kitchen," he said. A pause. Other than that, he thought of Pete Calloway, who ran the adjacent grazing lease to the north and had known Gideon for 30 years and had a gun safe the size of a small room and a deep distrust of anyone from the county office that dated back to a zoning dispute in 2009. "Fine," he said. "I have somewhere." He drove to Calloway's. He didn't explain much because he didn't need to. Pete Calloway looked at the documents in their oilskin, looked at Gideon's face, and opened the gun safe without a word. The documents went in next to Pete's deed collection and a very old bottle of bourbon that he'd apparently been keeping there for 15 years and did not offer to share, which was fine. Gideon drove back. What he found when he got back was not fine. There was a truck parked in his drive that he didn't recognize for a moment, and then recognized all at once in the way you recognize something you haven't seen in years: the specific configuration of scratches on the driver's door, the bent antenna that had been bent since 2019, the bumper sticker from a state university that had been there long enough to become permanent. His son's truck. Rowan Thorne was 31 years old and looked like Gideon had looked at 31, which was a thing Gideon found alternately gratifying and unsettling. He had his mother's eyes, which was the part that always got Gideon first, walking into a room and seeing Lenora looking back at him from a face that was otherwise entirely his own. Rowan was sitting on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees and his face doing something complicated that he hadn't smoothed out yet because he hadn't seen Gideon pull up. When he did see him, the face went, "Careful, Dad." "Rowan." Gideon got out of the truck. "This is unexpected." "I was going to call." Rowan looked at the fence line. At the orchard beyond it, his jaw was doing the same thing Gideon's jaw did under stress, which was set hard and stay there. "I heard some things." "From who does it matter?" "If it was Mabel Fitch, yes." Rowan looked at him. "Someone from the county assessor's office called Uncle Miles. Said there was some kind of dispute about the property, that you might need family support." "Miles called me," he paused. "Who's the woman?" The way he said the woman was the problem. It wasn't hostile exactly. It was the specific neutrality of someone working very hard not to be hostile, which is sometimes worse. "Her name is Elwyn Mercer," Gideon said. "She owns the orchard next door. She inherited it from her grandfather, and you're helping her." "Yes." Rowan looked at the fence again. "How much are you helping her?" Gideon considered his options and chose the one that was going to be painful regardless of how he arranged it. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee and tell you what's actually happening, which is going to take a while because it's complicated." "Is she going to be there?" "I don't know. Probably." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and followed his father inside, which was something at least. Elwyn was not there when they walked in, which bought Gideon 20 minutes to explain the land situation, the acquisition order, the forged document, the hidden will, Vane's arrest. Rourke and Rowan listened the way he always listened to information he didn't want to be processing, which was with perfect stillness and the expression of a man running calculations he hadn't agreed to run. When Gideon finished, Rowan said, "The will, the single-family clause. Yes, you'd have to operate as one estate, yes." Rowan was quiet for 10 seconds. "Are you in love with her?" Gideon had expected the question and still wasn't ready for it. He looked at his kitchen table, where a lot of things had been said in the last 24 hours. "I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that," he said, which was the most honest version of yes he could currently manage. Rowan heard it as yes. His face did something that was not anger exactly, but was close enough to anger's neighborhood to be relevant. "Dad," he said, "she's 30 years younger than you." 28 years. That's not a meaningful distinction. "I know, she's younger than me by 3 years, yes." Rowan stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the orchard and stood there with his back to his father. And Gideon watched his son's shoulders and recognized the posture, because it was his own posture, the posture of a man who has something to say that he isn't sure he has the right to say. "She's not, Mom," Rowan said. His voice was careful. "Flat in the way that means the opposite of flat underneath." "No," Gideon said, "she's not. Nobody is. You're going to marry someone who's closer to my age than yours." "I haven't asked her anything," Gideon said. "We haven't had that conversation yet." "But you're going to." Gideon didn't answer, which was again an answer. Rowan turned around. His eyes were Lenora's eyes, and in them was something that Gideon hadn't expected to see, not just anger, but something younger than anger. Something closer to afraid. "What if she leaves?" Rowan said. "What if she's 20 years from now and she's and you're—" He stopped. He tried again. "What if something happens to you?" And there it was. Not the age difference. Not some possessiveness about Lenora's memory. The real thing underneath all of it, a 31-year-old man who had watched his mother die and was now looking at his father and was terrified of losing anyone else he loved. Trying to protect himself by objecting to the thing before the thing could hurt him. Gideon understood this with complete clarity because he had been doing the same thing himself for 11 years. He said something might happen. "Yeah." Rowan stared at him. "Something might happen to me in 5 years or 20 years or next Tuesday," Gideon said. "Something might happen to her. Something might happen to you, which is a thought I don't sit with any more often than I have to. But I've been making decisions based on what might go wrong for 11 years now, Rowan, and all it's gotten me is 11 years of nothing in particular." He held his son's gaze. "Your mother left me a letter. In the attic. I found it 2 days ago." Rowan went very still. "I haven't read it yet," Gideon said. "But I read the journal entry she wrote before it. And what she said, what she left me, wasn't be careful. It was the opposite of that. He paused. She knew me better than I know myself. She always did. The door opened. Elowen came in from the porch the way she always did without ceremony, wiping her boots on the mat, already talking about something practical. The low field's draining faster than I expected. The road should be passable by. She stopped. She saw Rowan. The room had a specific texture for 2 seconds, the texture of a space where everyone knows something important is happening and nobody is sure which direction it's going to go. Rowan looked at her. She looked at him. She'd been told enough about him over the months to recognize him immediately: Lenora's eyes, Gideon's jaw, that particular watchfulness that ran in the family. She didn't extend her hand. She didn't smile in the manufactured way of someone trying to make a good impression. She just met his gaze and said, "You must be Rowan." "I'm Elowen. I'm sorry I'm walking in on I can come back." "No," Gideon said. "Stay." Rowan looked at his father. Then back at her. Something was running behind his eyes that Gideon couldn't read yet. "You know about the will," Rowan said. "Not a question." "Yes," Elowen said. "The clause." "Yes. And you're the two of you are going to." "We haven't decided anything yet," Elowen said. "There's a forensic review happening and a state investigation, and your father's friend Vane got arrested this afternoon for something he didn't do, which is its own crisis." She looked at Rowan with the flat, direct look that Gideon had spent months learning to recognize as her baseline mode. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not asking him for anything right now either. We're trying to get through today." Rowan looked at her for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. "My mother," he started. "I know," Elowen said. "I know she was. I know who she was to him. And to you, I'm not trying to be anything she was. I'm just—" She stopped. She looked at the table. Something shifted in her face that was not her usual composure, something that was simply a person being seen more clearly than she'd been expecting. "I'm just me, trying to hold on to a piece of land my grandfather loved." And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she stopped again. She didn't finish it, but she looked at Gideon when she stopped, and Rowan tracked that look, and something in him, slow, reluctant, not resolved, but shifting, went from locked to slightly less locked. He sat back down at the table. "Okay," he said. "Tell me about Vane." "And what we're doing about it." They worked through the afternoon as a unit of 3 people who did not have a name for what they were yet, and did not try to name it. Rowan had his mother's gift for logistics. He mapped out the chain of calls, identified which state contacts could accelerate Vane's release, cross-referenced the survey documents Gideon had photos of on his phone against public county records that Rowan pulled up on his laptop. He was good at it, and he didn't make a point of being good at it, and by late afternoon, Gideon found himself watching his son work and feeling something that had been absent for so long he almost didn't recognize it. Something like hope, the plain, practical kind, not the dramatic variety. Just the sense that the thing in front of you might come out all right. The call from Inspector Foss came at 4:47. "The forensic preliminary is done," she said. "Both documents clear initial review. The authenticity assessment will take another 48 hours for full certification, but the preliminary is enough to trigger a state-level review of the county office's handling of this entire corridor assessment." A pause. "Calder Vane is being released this evening. The forgery charges don't hold up against his documented timeline. He was at your property all night, which you can confirm." "I can confirm," Gideon said. "The acquisition orders for your properties and the 5 others along the corridor are formally suspended pending investigation. Mayor Rourke's office was contacted by state investigators this afternoon." Another pause, briefer. "I'd suggest not going anywhere in the next week. We're going to need statements." She hung up. Gideon set the phone on the table. Rowan and Elowen were both looking at him. "Vane gets released tonight," he said. "Acquisition orders suspended." State investigation opened on Rourke. Rowan let out a breath. Elowen closed her eyes for 1 second and opened them. "And the will," she said. "Still subject to forensic review," he said. But Foss said the preliminary clears, the single-family clause. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. Vane arrived at 9 that evening looking like a man who had spent 12 hours in a county facility being professionally cooperative while internally furious. He had a cut on his lower lip that he hadn't had that morning, and a careful story about how it happened that everyone present understood was a careful story. He sat at Gideon's kitchen table and accepted coffee, and didn't say much for the first 20 minutes, which Gideon respected. Then he said, Rourke knew about the iron box. The table went quiet. One of the investigators told me off the record that Rourke's office received a tip 3 weeks ago that there might be original documents somewhere on the Mercer property. They didn't know where. They were waiting for a way to access the property without triggering a formal process. Vane looked at Elowen. The storm was convenient. If the coroner had come down a different way, if the box had been accessible from outside, or if they'd gotten there first. It would have disappeared, Elowen said. Yes, Rowan said. How much of the corridor scheme is documented? Enough, Vane said. Survey manipulations, signature forgeries, shell company land purchases along the route going back 12 years. Rourke was running it through a private investment group that his office had no official connection to. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. He was going to be extraordinarily wealthy in about 4 years once the corridor was approved and the land values spiked. 6 families stood between him and that, 6 families. 6 properties. Gideon thought about the people he knew along that valley corridor, the Hallorans, with their dairy operation, the Vasquez family that had been there since before Red Hollow was incorporated, old Ruth Embury, who had been threatening to sell for years but never did. 6 families who had been going through what he and Elowen had been going through, without the attic or the iron box or the sheer stubborn luck of a fence that had been broken in the same 3 places for 11 years. Will they get their properties back? Gideon asked. The ones that haven't sold yet, yes, Vane said. The ones that already sold, it's more complicated. Pending investigation, possible restitution. He looked at his coffee. It's not a clean ending for everyone. Gideon thought about Clara Dean, who had hidden the truth in a wall because she hadn't known how to use it. He thought about all the years between 1961 and now where that wall had just been a wall. He thought about the specific chain of circumstances, the fence, the cow, the broken box bottom, the burned dinners, the Tuesday in May, the storm that had led 2 people to a lantern in a broken building at 6:47 in the morning to find an iron box that changed everything. You could call that luck. He didn't have another word for it. Rowan went to bed in the spare room at 11. He didn't say much when he said goodnight, but he looked at Elowen when he passed her and gave her a nod that was small and not warm but was not nothing, and Gideon counted it. Vane went to the motel in town, and Gideon and Elowen were alone in the kitchen for the first time in what felt like days. Because in some ways it had been days, and the house was quiet the way it gets when everything urgent has finally been handled, and what's left is just the thing that was there before the urgency started. She had her hands around her own coffee cup, looking at the table. He went to the kitchen drawer and opened it. He took out the old feed receipt with its pencil list. Fix south fence, clean gutters, call Rowan. He put it on the table between them. She looked at it. She read the list. She looked up at him. I wrote that the year after Lenora died, he said. I didn't do any of it. I've been carrying it around in that drawer for 11 years. He sat down across from her. Rowan's here. The fence is fixed. That's 2. She waited. He reached into his shirt pocket and put the letter on the table. Lenora's envelope, unopened, his name in her handwriting. He'd brought it down from the attic the night before the storm and had been carrying it since, waiting for the moment when he was ready, and he was beginning to understand that ready was not a state that arrived on its own. You had to decide to be it. He opened the envelope. He read it with Elowen across the table, not because he needed her there for it, but because he'd been alone with things for 11 years, and he was done making that choice. The letter was 3 pages. He read all of it. When he was done, he folded it back and put it in the envelope and sat quietly for a moment with his hand on it. Then he said, She said the worst thing I could do was be careful with the rest of my life. Elowen didn't say anything. She said he stopped. He tried again. She said to find someone worth the risk. She said she hoped he already knew who it was. He looked up at Elowen. She used he. She was talking to me. He looked at the envelope. But I think she might have been talking about you too, in a way. In the way she always talked like she'd already seen what was going to happen and was just leaving instructions. The kitchen was very quiet. Elowen set her coffee cup down. She reached across the table and put her hand over his and didn't say anything and didn't need to. Outside, the orchard was dark and wet and smelled like rain and apple blossom and turned earth, and the low field had drained to almost nothing. And somewhere out there were two properties that had been one property once and been separated by fraud and held apart by fear and by time, and that were now forensics pending, investigation ongoing. Single-family clause sitting in an authenticated will at Pete Calloway's house next to 15-year-old Bourbon waiting. Just waiting, for two people to stop finding reasons. He didn't ask her that night. He had wanted to. He had sat across the kitchen table from her with Lenora's letter under his hand, and the single-family clause sitting in Pete Calloway's gun safe, and everything pointing in one direction, and he had wanted to say the thing that needed saying. But wanting and doing had always been two different countries for Gideon Thorne, with considerable distance between them, and that night the distance was still too much. What he did instead was walk her back across the fence line at midnight, through the low field that had drained to ankle depth by then, holding the flashlight so she could see where to step. At the gap in the fence, he stopped and she stopped, and they stood there for a moment in the dark with the wet grass and the smell of the storm's aftermath around them. She said, "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." Neither of them moved for another 10 seconds. Then she went through the gap and up toward her house, and he watched the light go on in her kitchen and stood at the fence until it did. The way he had every night for months, without admitting to himself that was what he was doing. He went inside. He slept, which surprised him. Not well, not long, but the particular sleep of a man whose body has finally accepted that it cannot sustain another hour upright. He woke at 5:30 to the sound of his own heartbeat being too loud, and lay in the gray light of early morning, thinking about what Lenora had written in that letter, not the instruction to stop. Being careful, he'd been thinking about that for hours. The other part, the part he hadn't said out loud to Elowen. "I hope she argues with you," Lenora had written. "I hope she pushes back and holds her ground and doesn't let you disappear into that silence of yours. You need someone who won't let you disappear. I couldn't always stop you. I hope she's better at it than I was." He lay there with that for a while. Then he got up and made coffee and went out to check the cattle, and the morning was the specific kind of clear that only comes after a serious storm, the air scrubbed clean, the light sharper than usual, every color a version of itself with the volume turned up. The cattle were fine. The south fence was holding. Somewhere in the orchard he could hear Elowen moving, the specific sounds of someone checking on their trees after weather, walking the rows, stopping, moving on. He didn't go to her yet. He needed to do one thing first. He went back inside and picked up his phone and called Rowan. Rowan answered from the spare room, clearly just awake. "Dad, what time is it?" 6:15, sorry. "No, you're not." "I need to tell you something." A pause, the sound of Rowan sitting up. "Okay, I'm going to ask her," Gideon said. "I wanted you to know before I did. Not because I need your permission, I don't, and you know that. But because you're my son and it matters to me that you hear it from me first." He paused. "And because I think your mother would have said the same thing. That you deserve to hear the real things from the people who love you, not from whatever version reaches you secondhand." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Gideon started to recalibrate, to prepare for the conversation that would be harder than this one. Then Rowan said quietly, she'd have liked her. Gideon hadn't expected that. He sat down on the kitchen chair. "Mom," Rowan said. She'd have liked Elowen, the way she doesn't perform anything. Mom couldn't stand people who performed. He was quiet for a moment. I'm still working on it, Dad. I'm not going to pretend I'm all the way there. But I'm not going to be the thing that stops you either. Gideon held the phone and didn't trust his voice for a moment. I know, he said. Go ask her, Rowan said, before you think about it so long it calcifies. He used Lenora's word, whether he knew it or not. Gideon put the phone down and went out the back door and through the gap in the fence without stopping for his jacket, which he only noticed when the morning air hit him, and by then he was already most of the way across. He found her at the East Row, the Heritage Variety section, checking the trees that the storm had knocked around. She had her back to him, and she was examining a graft union on a younger tree, turning a branch in her hands, and she heard him coming across the wet ground and didn't turn around immediately. How bad, he said. Could be worse, she said. 3 of the younger grafts are stressed. 2 of the older trees lost major limbs, but the structure's sound. She set the branch down and turned to face him. She looked at him for a moment. You didn't bring your jacket. I know. She looked at his face, that flat, evaluating look, the one that had been reading him accurately since March. Gideon, she said. I'm going to say something, he said. And I need to get through it before I start editing it, so if you could just let me get through it. She waited. I've been alone for 11 years, he said. And I told myself I was fine with it. I wasn't fine with it. I was just used to it, which is different, and I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. And then you came over that fence line with your broken box bottom, and your burned dinners and your complete refusal to need things from me that I hadn't offered, and he stopped. When again, I don't have a speech. I'm not a speech person. But I know that I drove to Pete Calloway's house last night and looked at that will in his gun safe, and the only thing I felt when I read the single-family clause was that I wanted it to be real. Not for the land. The land is the land will sort itself. I wanted it to be real because it's you. He looked at her across the wet grass and the broken morning light. I'm 58 years old and my back is unreliable, and I have an adult son who is working on accepting this, and a ghost in the attic that I've been living with for 11 years. I'm not a clean proposition, I know, she said, but I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that he couldn't categorize, not surprise. She'd seen this coming, but something more complicated than expectation met. Something that was simply the weight of a real thing arriving in real time, which is always heavier than you've calculated. You left your jacket, she said. Yes. That's the most impulsive thing you've ever done. Probably. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. Clearer. That's my answer. Yes. He crossed the 4 feet between them, and she met him halfway, and he put his arms around her in the east row of the orchard, with the storm-cleared light coming through the apple trees, and it was not graceful. They were both too practical for graceful, but it was solid and real, and she smelled like wet earth and cedar, and she held on the way a person holds when they've been waiting for a thing, and are now not going to let go of it easily. He didn't cry. He thought about crying. He didn't. But his jaw was tight for a different reason than it usually was, and he held on longer than he had planned to, and she let him. The forensic authentication took 11 days. In those 11 days, Mayor Silas Rourke was arrested on charges that included land fraud, forgery of county documents, misuse of public office, and conspiracy to defraud property owners' 6 families, confirmed, with the 7th under investigation. The arrest was not quiet. The state sent investigators who arrived in 4 vehicles and spent 2 days at County Hall and left with 12 boxes of records. And Red Hollow watched all of it through diner windows and front porches, and the particular horrified fascination of a town that has just discovered the man who ran their 4th of July parade for 9 consecutive years was systematically stealing from their neighbors. Mabel Fitch was not arrested. She had not known the full extent of what she'd been participating in. She'd passed information about the Mercer property to her nephew in good faith, genuinely believing she was helping assess a legitimate government matter. And the nephew had passed it to contacts in Rourke's office without telling her what it was for. Gideon did not find this completely satisfying, but it was the truth, and he'd learned enough in the last to know that not every villain in a story is a full villain. Some of them are just people who didn't ask the right questions. Mabel did stop talking about Elowen. That was something. Calder Vane was formally cleared on the 12th day. He drove out to the property to tell them himself, which he didn't have to do but did, and he stood at Elowen's gate in better clothes than the last time, and with the cut on his lip healed to a faint line. And he told them the forgery charge had been expunged from his record, and the county investigator who'd arrested him was under review. He looked at them both, at Elowen and then at Gideon, and at the specific way they were standing together that hadn't been there the last time he'd seen them, and he said, "I'm glad." Gideon believed him. He wasn't entirely sure when he'd started trusting Vane, but it had happened somewhere between the diner table and the lantern in the broken storage edition. And trust extended on the basis of evidence was, in his experience, the only kind worth having. "What happens to your assessment now?" Elowen asked. "The corridor project is suspended pending a full review," Vane said. "Which, given that its primary architect just got arrested, is going to be a very thorough review." He half smiled, which was a different smile from the one he'd arrived in town wearing. "Less polished. Better. The 6 families keep their properties." Ruth Embury apparently told the state investigators she would have known something was wrong sooner if Rourke's office hadn't sent such good-looking men to do the devaluation assessments. She said it directly to Inspector Foss. "I have it on good authority Foss did not know how to respond to that." Elowen laughed. Actually laughed the unguarded kind, the kind that's slightly louder than a person intends. Gideon found he still wasn't tired of that sound. Vane left after 20 minutes. He shook Gideon's hand at the gate, and the handshake was real firm, brief, the handshake of 2 men who have been through something together and are acknowledging it without making a ceremony of it. On the 14th day, Inspector Foss called with the authentication results. "Both documents are confirmed authentic," she said. "The original partnership inventory and the family will. Clara Dean's letter has also been authenticated as consistent with the period." A pause. "The altered document from your attic, the version with the debt clause, was modified sometime in the early 1970s. We tracked the typeface used for the inserted clause to a specific machine that was in use at the county recorder's office between 1969 and 1975. "So it wasn't Rourke," Gideon said. "Rourke was 8 years old in 1972, Foss said. "No. Whatever happened then was the beginning of something that he inherited and expanded on. We're still investigating the original alteration. It's possible we'll never know the full story of who started it." Gideon thought about Clara Dean hiding a box in a wall and writing a letter that started with "Whoever finds this." He thought about 60 years of a wrong sitting in a wall, waiting for a right storm to break the right corner. "The consolidation clause," he said, "is valid," Foss said, "and applicable. If both properties formally operate as a single-family estate, which would require marriage or equivalent legal consolidation, the unified holding has full legal standing under the original will. Both homesteads together, as they were always meant to be." She gave them the details for the legal process and rang off. Gideon stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand. He had asked Elowen in an orchard at 6 in the morning without his jacket. She had said yes. They had not discussed the details in the days since, because the days since had been full of investigations and cleared charges and the relentless administrative machinery of a land fraud case that was generating paperwork faster than anyone could file it. But the yes was still there. Neither of them had qualified it. They got married on a Thursday in the 3rd week of June at the county clerk's office in town, with Rowan as witness and Vane as the second signature, and a clerk named Dorothy, who had been doing this job for 22 years and still smiled at every couple that came through. Not out of performance, but apparently out of the genuine conviction that people committing to each other was worth smiling at, which Gideon found he agreed with. It was not a dramatic ceremony. There were no flowers and no music, and Elowen wore a blue dress that she'd had for years, and Gideon wore the good shirt that Rowan had made him iron that morning, because Rowan had strong opinions about collars. Dorothy said the legal words, and they said the necessary words, And then Dorothy handed them the certificate and said congratulations with the same warmth she'd presumably given every couple before them and would give every couple after. Outside the county clerk's office on the sidewalk, Rowan handed Gideon his jacket. It was June, but the morning was cool and said, "Mom would have complained about your shirt collar even after ironing it." "She would have," Gideon said. "It looks fine," Rowan said. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the three of them, with Vane waiting tactfully by his car a distance away. Then Rowan looked at Elowen and said stiffly, "Working through it, I'm glad he didn't stay on that train." Elowen looked at him. "What train?" Rowan looked at Gideon. Gideon said, "I haven't told her that part yet." "What train?" Elowen said again. They drove back to the property in 2 trucks, and on the way Gideon called her and talked through the speaker while he drove. And he told her about the morning after the night she had said yes, the morning when the fear had come back, the old reliable fear, dressed up in the usual clothes. He told her that he had driven to the train station in the next town over, that he had bought a ticket to no specific destination, that he had sat on a bench in the station for 20 minutes with his bag between his feet and Lenora's letter in his shirt pocket, and had been genuinely about to board. "And then," she said through the speaker, "and then I thought about what you said. About fear with a better name." He kept his eyes on the road. "And I thought about Lenora's letter, and I thought about the fact that I had left my jacket at the fence line again." He paused, and I drove back. Silence on the line. "You were going to leave," she said. "Yes, without telling me." "Yes, Gideon, I know." Another silence. "Then if you ever do that again, I will personally." "I know," he said. "I won't. I'm serious. I know you're serious." "I know." He turned onto the road that led to the valley. "I came back. You came back," she said, "this time." "Every time," he said. That's what I'm telling you." Every time. "I came back, and I'm going to keep coming back because I'm done making the other choice." The line was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. Quiet, simple, the single word that had always been enough between them. "Okay," he said. They hung up and drove the rest of the way in their separate trucks and met at the gate of what was now, legally and finally, a single consolidated property. The legal consolidation process took another 6 weeks' paperwork, filings, the transfer of both titles into a unified estate holding. Inspector Foss had been right that it was workable, and Vane had been helpful in ways that went beyond his professional obligations, which Gideon suspected was partly genuine and partly the penance of a man who felt he owed them something for the arrive in their lives with a government demolition order and making everything harder before he helped make it better. Either way, the help was real. The 5 other families along the corridor received confirmation of their suspended acquisition orders during those same weeks. Ruth Embury, who had been the most vocal about the whole business from the beginning, organized a dinner at the community hall in Red Hollow that she invited everyone to, and which turned into the kind of evening that small towns occasionally produce, loud, overlapping, full of stories getting more dramatic with each telling. The specific warmth of people who have been through something hard together and have come out the other side and need to mark it somehow. Gideon went because Elowen wanted to go. He sat at the long table and ate Ruth's inexplicably excellent pot roast and watched his wife talk to people with the particular ease of a woman who had stopped being the newcomer and become, without entirely meaning to, the person that the corridor story kept circling back to, the one who had found the iron box, who had read Clara Dean's letter, who had pushed when pushing was necessary and held when holding was what was needed. Rowan was there too. He sat next to Elowen, and they talked about something that Gideon couldn't hear from his end of the table, and at one point Elowen said something that made Rowan laugh, actually laugh. The unguarded kind. And Gideon looked at his son laughing and his wife making it happen and thought, there it is. The thing Lenora had wanted for him. Right there at a long table with pot roast and people telling stories louder than necessary. He had almost missed it. He had almost gotten on a train. 2 months after the wedding, Elowen sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where a lot of the real things in their lives had been said. the table that had become the gravitational center of whatever this life was, and she told him something that she delivered in the direct, factual, no-performance way. She delivered all significant information, which was that she was pregnant. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet. You don't have to." "I know." She had her hands flat on the table. "I'm 43 days along. I went to the clinic in town, and then I went again because I didn't entirely trust the first result." She paused. "It's real." He sat with it. He sat with the particular sensation of a man who has reconfigured his understanding of what his future looked like and is now being asked to reconfigure it again, in a direction he had genuinely not anticipated. At 58 years old, on a Thursday morning in his own kitchen. "Okay," he said. She looked at him more carefully. "That's all?" He stopped. He tried to find the right word for what he was, and the honest answer was that he was several things at once, which was not a clean answer, but was the true one. "I'm scared," he said, "and I'm glad." "Those aren't contradictory," she said. "No," he said, "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same way she'd done the night he read Lenora's letter, and they sat like that for a while in the morning kitchen, with the sound of the orchard outside and the two properties that were now one property and the life that was now undeniably more than he had been prepared for. She called Rowan herself. Gideon listened from the kitchen while she made the call in the next room, and he heard her voice through the wall, steady, direct. No preamble, and then he heard nothing for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable, and then he heard Elowen say, quietly, "I know." "We didn't plan it, and then I know, and then something he couldn't make out." When she came back, she sat down and said, "He needs some time." "I know, he'll come around. I know that too." She looked at him. "Are you sure Rowan is his mother's son?" Gideon said. She always came around. It just took her a little while to say so. 3 weeks later, Rowan drove out on a Sunday. He didn't call ahead. He showed up at the gate and walked through to the porch where Gideon was sitting with coffee and sat down in the other chair, and they sat together for a few minutes, not saying anything, which was their most functional mode. Then Rowan said, "I talked to someone. A counselor. About Mom. About all of it." He looked at the orchard. She said the counselor said that wanting my dad to stay alone wasn't about him. It was about me not having processed the loss yet. He said processed like a man trying a word that didn't come naturally to him. Which I knew. I just hadn't said it. Gideon nodded. "I'm not going to be weird about the baby," Rowan said. "I might need some time to figure out how to be whatever I'm supposed to be. But I'm not going to be weird about it." "I know," Gideon said. "You don't have to say I know to everything." "I know," Gideon said. Rowan looked at him. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You're doing that on purpose." "Little bit." Rowan shook his head, and the tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction, and they sat together on the porch of a ranch house that had been silent for 11 years and was not silent anymore. Elowen came out with coffee she hadn't asked if they wanted and set it between them and went back inside, which was exactly the right thing to do, and exactly how she always did things, present without hovering, there without making it about being there. Rowan watched her go. "She's good, not warm yet." "But true." "Yes," Gideon said. "She is." The twins were born the following March, 11 months after a storm broke a corner in a storage addition and exposed a box that had been waiting 60 years for the right people to find it. They arrived 5 weeks early, which was not the plan but was, as Elowen said, from a hospital bed at 2 in the morning, with a grip on Gideon's hand that was going to leave marks, consistent with how everything in their lives had gone so far. The girl came first, then the boy, and they were small in the way of early arrivals. Spending their first 2 weeks in the NICU under the careful watch of nurses who had seen everything and were cheerfully matter-of-fact about all of it in a way that Gideon found deeply reassuring. He sat beside the incubators for 12 hours the first day. He was 59 years old, and he had a bad back and a son down the hall in the waiting room eating vending machine sandwiches, and a wife sleeping in a room on the second floor because she needed the rest more than she needed to be awake. and he sat with his two children, who were the size of things that should not yet be in the world, and talked to them quietly, not about anything important. About the orchard, about the cattle, about a fence that had been broken in the same 3 places for 11 years, and what it had cost him and what it had given him. He didn't cry then either. He was going to have to figure that out eventually. He could feel it catching up to him. They named the girl Nora. Not Lenora, not that, but close enough to be intentional, close enough to mean something. Rowan, when he heard the name, went very still and then nodded once and didn't say anything, which meant everything. The boy was Henry, after Elowen's grandfather, whose iron box and apple orchard and 70 years of keeping everything had made all of this possible. They came home in April to a property that had spent the winter under Rowan's management he had offered, and they had said yes, and he had done it with the same competence he brought to everything, which meant the cattle were fine, and the orchard was fine, and the fence was still holding. And when they pulled up the drive with 2 car seats in the back of the truck, the place looked the way it had always looked, which was real and imperfect, and theirs. Rowan came out of the house when they pulled in. He stood at the porch and waited while Gideon got the first car seat out, and then the second, and then he came down the steps and he looked at Nora, who was awake and looking back at him with the serious, unfocused expression of a person who is still deciding what faces mean. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Gideon. "She has Mom's forehead," he said. Gideon looked at his daughter. He hadn't seen it until that moment. "Yeah," he said. Rowan held out his hands, asking without asking, and Gideon transferred the car seat to him and watched him carry his half-sister up the porch steps and through the door of the house that had been too quiet for too long. And behind them, Elowen came around the truck with Henry and stood beside Gideon at the base of the porch steps and looked at the door where Rowan had just gone. "It's going to be okay," she said. "I know," he said. She gave him a look. "I'm not doing it on purpose this time," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. She raised an eyebrow. He made a sound that was almost the same as the sound Rowan had made on the porch, the one that was almost a laugh. They went inside. 3 years after that, in the summer, in the heat that the valley accumulated like a debt, Gideon stood on the porch of the restored house in the evening light and watched Nora and Henry run between the apple trees in the east row. They were moving fast the way small children move, with the specific fearlessness of people who have not yet learned to calculate risk, their voices carrying across the orchard in the way voices carry when the air is still and the trees are full. The storage addition had been properly rebuilt over the winter. With actual engineering this time, Rowan had overseen it, and Gideon had been consulted on every decision. And Elowen had been the one to find the carpenter who could match the original timber style while meeting current structural codes. The iron box was on the mantelpiece in the main room, empty now, the clasp replaced with a new one. Clara Dean's letter was framed beside it. Elowen came out and stood beside him with 2 glasses of water because it was too hot for anything else, and they stood on the porch and watched the children move between the trees where a government road had once been planned to run. "Nora found a bird's nest today," Elowen said. "Did she?" "In the 3rd tree of the east row. She's been visiting it every hour. That's going to end badly. The birds are going to be fine. She's just looking." Elowen drank her water. Henry tried to dig to the fence line with a spoon. "Which spoon?" "The wooden stirring spoon. I don't know why he thought that would work better than a real one." She looked out at the orchard. "He's your son." Gideon considered this. "That seems unfair." "It seems accurate." The light was going golden the way it did in the valley on summer evenings. The specific color that photographers tried to catch and usually managed to capture the surface of without getting the weight of it, the way it lay on the grass and the bark of the trees and the faces of the people standing in it. Gideon stood in it and felt it on the back of his hands, which were the hands of a 59-year-old rancher whose back still gave him trouble. And he thought about a fence that had been broken for 11 years, and a letter in an attic, and a Tuesday in May when he'd said something as a joke and a 28-year-old woman hadn't laughed. He thought about getting on a train. He thought about coming back. He had a recurring thought in the years since that the most important decision of his life had not been asking Elowen to marry him in the East Row at 6 in the morning without his jacket. The most important decision had been the one that came before it, the one that had involved getting off a bench in a train station and pointing his truck back toward a fence line and a woman with a broken box bottom and a determination not to be managed. The decision to stop letting fear be the one making choices. That was the one that had changed everything. He didn't think about it sentimentally. He was not a sentimental man, which Elowen had told him in almost those exact words during their first winter together, following it immediately with "but you're a devoted one," which is rarer and better, which he had turned over enough times since that it had become something close to true. He thought about it the way he thought about most real things, practically, plainly, as a fact that had weight. Some things in a life you only understand backward. You don't know you're making the choice that matters until you've already made it and lived long enough to see what it built. The children came out of the orchard and across the grass toward the porch, running the way they ran everywhere, full speed and without strategy. Henry slightly ahead because he had longer legs and had not yet figured out that Nora was faster when she decided to be. They hit the porch steps at the same time and came up arguing about something that had happened in the orchard involving the nest and a stick, and Elowen said inside, "Wash your hands," in the voice that moved children faster than any other voice either of them possessed, and they went in. The orchard was quiet. The fence was holding. Somewhere in the house, Rowan was calling. He called on Sunday evenings, reliably, the same way he did everything, and the calls had gotten longer over the years and less careful, which was the specific progress of a person who has decided to stop protecting himself from his own family. Elowen went inside to answer it. Gideons stayed on the porch a little longer. He stood in the evening light with his water glass and the orchard in front of him and the house behind him, and he thought about Lenora not with the weight he used to carry it, but with the particular tenderness of a man who has kept a love intact by not letting it be the thing that stopped him. She was not gone from this life. She was in Rowan's eyes, and in the name on the girl running through the apple trees, and in a letter on the mantelpiece next to an iron box, and in the specific fact that he had learned from her what love looks like when it's working, when it's not, performing or protecting itself, but is simply showing up again and again without the guarantee of outcome. He had tried to stop. She had left instructions not to. He was glad he'd read them. Inside, the children were saying something loud about the spoon, and Elowen was laughing, and Rowan's voice was coming through the phone, and the house that had been too quiet for 11 years, that had had nothing playing in it since Lenora stopped filling the silence, was full of sound. Gideon finished his water. He went inside.